LiSTNR production.
A warning. This episode contains references to suicide, graphic descriptions of violence against women and sexual assault. If you're in danger and need support, dial 1-800-RESPECT on 1-800-737-732. In the autumn of 1997, New South Wales was rocked by the disappearance of Kerry Whelan. She was last seen on May 6th after being dropped off at the Park Royal Hotel in Parramatta. When she didn't return home, her husband Bernie quickly notified police. A search uncovered nothing and police were stumped. It wasn't until a day later they had a lead. A ransom note had appeared in Bernie's mailbox. Follow all instructions or your wife will die. Paul Grech, who was a junior detective at the time, helped solve the case and remembers the tiny detail that led them to the person responsible. I'm former police officer Brent Sanders, and for the past 25 years, I've dedicated myself to sharing what I've learnt on the force to the Australian public so they can better protect themselves from falling victim to crime. So with the help of some of the most respected current and former detectives and high-ranking law enforcement agents, we're going to pull back the curtain on what life is like on the force and what they've learned about how crime and criminals really work. These are real stories from real detectives.
At that point in time, I'd been paired up with Detective Sergeant Dennis Bray, who's a really old-school detective, and I do remember for the first week or two, we were kind of generally looking at each other, waiting for that job to come in. Well, the wait wasn't long in waiting, because on the 7th of May that year, 1997, we actually received a telephone call from detectives at Parramatta in relation to a fellow who reported his wife missing. Parramatta was, in fact still is, a really large police station, and there were reports of missing people there kind of all the time. So from our perspective, we were quite puzzled as to why we received a telephone call. But having said that, myself and Dennis did walk down from our offices to the Parramatta police station, which is about a 15-minute walk, and we were kind of quizzing each other as to why we would get this type of job. We went down and we briefed local detectives, but really it wasn't until late that evening that we were all called out, and what was discovered was that Bernie Whelan had returned to his home address at Kurrajong and found a ransom note for the return of his wife. That ransom note was for the sum of $1 million, and there were some really stringent conditions as to the safe return of his wife. As the days went on, there was a POI that was quickly identified, a fellow by the name Bruce Burrell. But something that we discovered very early in the piece was that there was CCTV outside the Park Royal Hotel in Parramatta where you could clearly see the victim walking from the car park. From the front foyer of that Park Royal Hotel, pointing towards opening and closing glass entrance doors. And it was through determination and a lot of phenomenal luck was that we could actually see a reflection from the front of those glass sheets onto the roadway. There was a vehicle picked up. It was a short wheelbase two-tone Pajero. That was one line of inquiry where there was a lot of time, a lot of energy involved, because at that point we had concluded that the POI was perhaps driving that motor vehicle. Back in those days, the CCTV images were black and white, and they were quite they certainly weren't as clearly defined as they are today. But through the reflection of that glass, we were able to, of course, come up with an image. And this particular professor, through his expertise, was able to determine through shades of black and white colour a colour image of what that vehicle was ultimately going to appear. So the investigation was certainly moving along, and I guess at one point in time there was a determination to execute a search warrant upon Bruce Burrell's property. Now, he had a property in the Southern Highlands. There was a lot of material seized, lots of documentation. We had a fellow on the strike force, Brian Malloy was his name, and he was an old school detective from the bush. And I do remember Brian Malloy probably spending about a week in the exhibit office downstairs at that point of time at the Penrith Police Station where the investigation was being run from. And Brian's modus operandi was to literally flick every single page of every single dossier, and I'm talking about probably 30, 40 dossiers that were seized from Burrell's premises. And the breakthrough came when Brian Malloy located a mud map as to how to plan and roll out the abduction. It was written in very broken words, but when you read it in totality, it was literally a mud map for him as to what he should do and what he shouldn't do. There was chloroform found inside his property. He might have used that as a stupefying drug. At that point of time, of course, we had a circumstantial brief. There was lots and lots of lawyers involved in decisions that were being made as to arresting and charging Bruce Burrell. Now, in the late 90s, of course, telephone technology was definitely out there, but certainly not as sophisticated as it is today. But there were lots and lots of call charge records and lots of reverse call charge records that were extrapolated from Bruce's mobile phone. You go through lots of processes, and when you're conducting these large-term investigations, obviously banking pieces of evidence that if something later on comes down the track, that bit of evidence that you bank might just be the piece you need to put together a really solid brief of evidence.
I'm interested in the ransom note that was presented to the husband, Bernie Whelan. I would imagine that the conditions around the ransom note would have, in some regards, dictated the movements of yourself and police in those early stages. Can you walk us through, are you able to highlight some of the conditions of that ransom note, and at what point did you start to realise that we had transitioned from a kidnapping ransom situation to potentially a homicide?
So that ransom note stipulated a couple of conditions. Bernie Whelan was an extremely wealthy man, and he had premises on the North Coast, premises in Sydney. Now, of course, we strongly believed, because we drew a connection involving Bruce Burrell, that Bruce might be privy to this intelligence, and trying to cover every single contingency was an absolute challenge. We had police stationed at the Richmond Air Force Base at that point of time because we had a police aeroplane on standby. Of course, with this type of investigation, everything remains covert. The ransom note clearly stipulated that if any police were involved, that he was never going to see Kerry Whelan again. So it's tricky and it's difficult ensuring that no cover is blown. Bernie Whelan had a property out at Currajong, but just simply conducting surveillance on his property is a really major feat because, of course, you're traversing down long, windy, dark roads, and any movements of any vehicle or any person can be very, very quickly picked up. So we had investigators actually residing at his property, keeping tabs on him, keeping tabs on the movement of anyone that may have traversed down to his property from the main road. So it is like perpetually playing a game of chess, and you're trying to forecast what the opponent may do. And of course, it's all done under the cloak of secrecy, because anytime anybody's exposed may have ultimately resulted in the harming of Kerry.
I'm interested in how things progressed to the point of there being sufficient evidence for him to be formally charged with the murder of Kerry Whelan.
About a month into the investigation, there was further information come to light in relation to the disappearance of Dorothy Davis. Now, Dorothy was a 74-year-old widow who lived in Low-Lying Bay in Sydney. She had suddenly disappeared, but the connection there was that Bruce Burrell, at one point of time, was living in Low-Lying Bay with his ex-wife, and they had become quite good friends. What surfaced was that he had befriended Dorothy Davis, and the information was that he hatched a plan with Dorothy Davis that he was given a sum of money that he can import diamonds from overseas and that she'd get a phenomenal return. And of course, she got some advice from a family member, and they quickly raised a flag that it could have been a scam or a hoax. But shortly thereafter, Dorothy went missing. There is legislation to talk about propensity and similar fact evidence. And ultimately, at the end of the day, after that line of inquiry was exhausted, there was some strong similarities between the two people that had been missing, and the fact that the common player, of course, was Bruce Burrell. So, it was a phenomenal investigation. It was a circumstantial brief evidence, of course, because Bruce Burrell didn't make admissions to being on the planet. I mean, he didn't speak to the police. And of course, he reverted to his right of silence. There were no bodies ever found. And they were ultimately circumstantial brief of evidence, which is something that is certainly not unheard of, but they're certainly quite rare. There was a whole brief of evidence put together. There were small bits and pieces of evidence. Ultimately, it was put through police legal services to make a determination. That was sent to the DPP. And look, at the end of the day, the DP made a determination that he should be arrested and charged with both of those missing people. And that's in fact what happened. And ultimately, a jury found him guilty, and he was convicted, and he was sentenced to 28 years in prison with a non-parole period of 21 years.
Paul, 1998, you're involved in yet, ironically, another double murder investigation, this one into Michael Canaan, which is a case stemming from an incident outside a pub in Five Dock in the inner western suburbs of Sydney. Can you have a chat to us about this case?
Yeah, absolutely. We were on call, and on the night of the 17th July 1998, we received a telephone call that there had been a shooting outside the Five Dock Hotel, which is located on Great North Road at Five Dock, of 3 young men. The background to the shooting was that a fellow by the name Michael Hurl, Adam Wright and Ron Singleton, they were just sitting there having drinks. There was some dialogue between 2 of those 3 men, which resulted in 2 of those 3 men being involved in a verbal altercation. That resulted in those 2 individuals walking outside the pub and having some heated words outside the hotel. There was a little bit of pushing going on. Both were a little bit inebriated, I dare say. And then there was a third player who, again, saw what was happening to his mates, went out to separate those 2 individuals. And as this was going on, a red Mitsubishi Magna pulled up and stopped at the set of lights outside that hotel. So inside that motor vehicle was an individual by the name of Michael Canaan, and there were some other individuals inside that car as well. There was an individual by the name of Alan Rossini. Now, Alan Rossini was sitting inside the front passenger side of that car and turned, and as they were waiting for the lights to turn green, saw the 3 men. And Rossini made a really silly mistake by trying to urge on those 3 mates. Of course, one of those 3 had turned away from the melee that was happening and directed his concerns towards the occupant of that car. As a result of that, one of those three that were on the footpath started walking towards the motor vehicle. The occupants of that car got out, and there was a big melee that ensued. The guys, Hurl and Wright and Singleton, were comfortably winning that fight that was going on. And of course, at that point of time, lots of people inside the hotel were looking outside on the roadway to see what was going on. Shortly after that ruckus, Michael Canaan produced a snub-nosed .22 caliber pistol and shot three of those men. Michael Hurl was shot twice. One of the rounds went through his jacket. Another round hit him in the chest. He fell to the ground. Adam Wright ran towards Michael Canaan, and of course he was then shot underneath the belly button. Ron Singleton then turned to assist his mates that had been shot, and Ron was then shot in the shoulder. Remarkably, lots of people from the Five Duck Hotel then left the hotel and started heading towards the assailants. It was just through pure luck that no one else was killed, because of course Michael Canaan pointed his handgun towards those other patrons, let off a round, missed all those people. He was then grabbed by another patron, but Michael was able to break loose, and he made his way to the motor vehicle. We actually have a statement from an individual who grabbed Michael as he was trying to drive off within that vehicle, and Michael pointed the gun at him and pulled the trigger, and it was just through sheer luck that there were no more rounds inside that revolver. So the vehicle sped off. As you can appreciate, there were lots of heavily traumatised people. Michael Hurl, unfortunately, had passed away. Adam Wright was taken to hospital, as was Ron Singleton, of course. And unfortunately, Adam Wright passed away the following day. We got called out, myself and Dennis Bray, but at that point of time, there were lots of detectives at the scene. The crime scene had been well bedded down and well examined, so there was a determination made that we would go out the following morning. With any type of job of this ilk, there's lots of crime scene examination which takes place. Now, we were fortunate, or we thought we were quite fortunate from the outset. A mobile phone was located on the footpath of the Five Dock Hotel, and that mobile phone was seized. There were lots of very, very extensive checks done on that mobile phone, subscriber checks, call charge records, reverse call charge records. And that phone was subscribed to a individual that had a really lengthy criminal history. So we were really confident that we were going to have someone in the dock quite early. Of course, that wasn't to be, because the individual whose name that was subscribed to was overseas, serving time in the Greek army. So it was really obvious from the outset that we were dealing with individuals that were very, very savvy with subscribing telephones in fictitious names. But of course, that telephone in itself was going to be a significant line of inquiry. That motor vehicle, by the way, was found. It was dumped in southwest Sydney. These individuals were quite clever in the fact that they sprayed the whole interior of that motor vehicle with lubricants. So any type of fingerprints and or DNA, even though it was quite at its infancy at that point of time, was totally obliterated. It was a high-profile investigation at that point of time. Prescriptively, there was a strike force that was formed. That strike force was ran from the Burrell police station. And from the earliest outset, Michael Canaan's name was flagged as a POI. But as a result of sifting through all those call charge records, we were able to find a lawyer in Sydney that had been contacting the phone. We ultimately executed a search warrant upon that solicitor's chambers We had a fair bit of luck. We were able to find a client's dossier which linked the number to the name, and that number was linked to the name Michael Canaan. So that was a really important piece of evidence. Now, of course, solicitors, and in particular defence solicitors, aren't the business of providing assistance to police, and again, it's their prerogative. There's no onus on witnesses or victims to give statements, and without naming or providing the details of that lawyer, basically he wasn't in a position to assist police. So that was a really crucial part of the brief. It corroborated lots of intel that was coming in, but really at that point of time, things for the Five Dock Hotel came to a bit of a standstill. But of course, there was, again, lots of anonymous information being disseminated to the police that one of the individuals within the strike force, an individual by the name of Rossini, was starting to live in body armour, and he was starting to distance himself from the main players within the syndicate. The information was that he absolutely feared for his own life, thinking that he'd created and been a part of something that was getting quite out of control. We were pretty solid to believe that Rossini was involved in distributing lots and lots of drugs, and as a result of that, he was honed in on. That proved to be a really, really successful strategy, because ultimately Alan Rossini was arrested and charged with commercial supply of drugs. He was bail refused, of course, and he was sent down to Goulburn jail. Now, everyone's aware of the climate in Goulburn, and he was basically put in isolation for some period of time. After that period of time, he was spoken to, and Alan Rossini decided to help himself. And at that point, Alan Rossini was taken out of the New South Wales Crime Commission, and he provided a recorded, basically, synopsis of his involvement regarding the criminal syndicate. As soon as we were able to obtain statements, they were then disseminated to members of the strike force that were then formulating investigation plans. Ultimately, Rossini was given full immunity, but of course there are some fairly stringent conditions involved in that, and of course one of those conditions was that he would give evidence on behalf of the Crown, and that's exactly what he did. It was as a result of those statements that I was then able to go out and arrest and charge Michael Canaan with the double murder of those two young men, and of course the attempted murder of Ron Singleton. He had some phenomenal defence represent him. Winston Terracini represented him all the way through, and of course Michael was refused to be interviewed, so he was ultimately charged. Brief evidence was put together involving lots of circumstantial evidence that we had, but ultimately Alan Rossini rolling and giving evidence was really critical. Michael Canaan was sentenced to 2 life imprisonments, so ultimately Michael will pass away in jail. It was a massive job, and again, for a fairly young detective, I absolutely hit the ground running. It was just one of those, once I would suggest in a career that you'd be exposed to this calibre and this ilk of investigation.
Coming up, the covert technique used to catch an elusive, high-profile drug runner.
We had received information that Seren was returning back after arranging another really large importation of drug. You have to obviously rely on investigative processes, but you certainly have to rely on a lot of luck as well.
Paul, early 2000s, you joined the Organised Crime Squad with the focus around drug importation and distribution. One particularly arduous investigation you're involved in is a drug dealer by the name of Seren Long. Can you chat a little bit about this individual and the work you did in this case?
Seren Long was an individual that had been involved in the drug importation and supply in southwest Sydney for quite a lengthy period of time. I was basically given a file. I was given a briefing. We had an inspector at that point of time that pulled me aside and basically said, mate, this individual has been a target for lengthy periods of time involving lots and lots of individuals. He concluded that she was pretty much untouchable, and he gave me a pat on the back and said, mate, good luck, because you're going to need it involving this individual target. That kind of motivated me to put my head down, backside up, get a really good group of investigators. At that point of time, the commander gave myself and the strike force lots of scope to kind of use whatever investigative flair and tools we had to try to target this individual. And that just, from the outset, involved conducting surveillance on her home address. We had lots of covert vehicles. As I said, we had lots of tools at our beck and call. We had surveillance police that were able to use. We had lots of really, really smart guys and girls. The breakthrough came as a result of some forensic evidence that we seized from the outside of Seren's premises. I don't want to go into a lot of detail because it reveals a little bit of police methodology, and I'm pretty comfortable and confident to say that methodology is still probably being used to this day. But irrespective, we ultimately were able to seize some forensic evidence to suggest that there were drugs inside her home address. And that resulted in us, into the strike force, supplying for and successfully being granted a telephone intercept. It was as a result of information from that telephone and, of course, the use of translators and interpreters, because Seren was able to talk a multitude of languages based on her country of origin. But we were able to determine that Seren had spent a lot of time overseas in areas like Thailand and in areas like Cambodia. And really, for the investigators, it was an absolute game of cat and mouse. We strongly suggested and believed that she was arranging importations of drug. And shortly after the investigation, we received information that there was a elderly Cambodian woman. And when I say elderly, I think she was about 82 years old at that point of time, had been intercepted by customs with a large quantity of heroin that were concealed inside pickled avocados, of all things. We were able to show through lots of really good intel analysis that there was an associate between this individual and Seren Long. This individual ultimately didn't want to talk to the police. She was hiding behind language issues, but ultimately she was arrested and charged with importation of heroin. She was about 82 at that point of time, and she was quite elderly and quite frail. But what we say is, of course, that she was given a large sum of money not to basically ask any questions and to pick up this container and bring it into Australia. Ultimately, we continued with the investigation, and as I said, drug work in particular, it is a perpetual game of cat and mouse. The objective is never to bring yourself under notice and to put together information from telephone intercepts and listening devices. Wind the clock forward about 6.5 months. Our listening post at that point of time was a caravan inside an aerodrome, which is no longer in southwest Sydney. It was the Hoxton Park aerodrome. And we had received information that Seren was returning back after arranging another really large importation of drug. And, sometimes when you're running these jobs, you have to obviously rely on investigative processes, but you certainly have to rely on a lot of luck as well. And on this particular day, all the moons had lined up after lots and lots of false calls. And Sunday morning, we received information that she was returning back from Cambodia to Sydney. And remarkably, even with lots and lots of police, we lost track of Seren. But she had a very, very distinctive motor vehicle. And of course, because of the calibre of target, we were also able to deploy Polair, which was also conducting surveillance for us. And it was just sort of sheer luck that Polair were able to pick up her motor vehicle from a house, and they then peeled off, and then we had our team pick her up. Of course, as I said from the outset, when you're involved in drug investigation, it's all about keeping low. It's never about exposing yourself. I made a very, very quick call that we were to get uniformed police involved, because, of course, it was going to be staged that if she left that house, that uniformed police were going to stop her. Again, lots of good luck. About half an hour after we located her place, after lots of heated discussions with duty officers at the Parramatta police station, we were to get a marked motor vehicle to sit around the corner from that home address. And by the way, we'd never come across that address she went to, but as I said, we had a bit of luck on our side. She left that address. The uniformed cars, 2 very junior constables stopped her, searched her, found a plastic bag underneath the back seat of her motor vehicle. And I remember there was a telephone call from this junior police officer saying, look, we found something, but we don't think it's drug. They weren't quite sure what they'd found, but of course, drug isn't just powder. Her modus operandi was importing compressed heroin, and that's in fact exactly what they found, compressed heroin. Once the balloon had went up, we got involved. She was arrested, she was charged, and she pleaded guilty. So, there are lots of tentacles in that investigation that I could spend probably a good half day talking about. But in essence, that was the nut and bolt of that particular investigation. I remember interviewing Sarah, and she didn't want to be interviewed, of course. And really, at that point in time, we didn't need her to be interviewed because, of course, the bag containing the drugs was fingerprinted, which showed a match to her prints. The drug was examined and shown to be heroin. So I remember charging her. She was a lady in her mid-40s, and I do remember that conversation had all those months ago by that inspector giving me a pat on the back saying, mate, good luck, you're going to need it with her. And ultimately, policing is about process, it's about methodology. But do you know what? Sometimes you need a bit of luck on your side, and that's what we had regarding this job. I think she got about 4.5, 5 years because of her early plea. Funnily enough, about 6, 7 years after that job, I remember getting a telephone call. She was subject to another strike force, and she was targeted again. So, she was an individual that never changed her colours. I mean, that was the way she lived. It was all about importing drugs.
I want to thank you, Paul, so much for coming in and joining us there up on the Gold Coast, and thank you for your service to the good people of New South Wales, and it's been a really enjoyable chat. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much for having me.
Crime Insiders Detectives is a LiSTNR original production. It's hosted by me, Brent Sanders, produced by Ed Gooden, and sound designed and imaged by Link Kelly.